So coming out of the MTC, I felt fairly confident in my French ability. Tahitian, not so much. I had a basis of French, of about 5 years before the MTC. Coming out of the MTC, felt like I had pretty much tripled all of my knowledge of French. Got to Tahiti. This strange kind of like fearlessness did set in right at the beginning. It was kind of like, now's the time to make mistakes. If I do make mistakes, I'll just be like, yeah, I've only been here a day, and then they'll be, sympathetic. So I remember getting to Tahiti and speaking to people. And because for whatever reason, just like all the fear was just like not there yet. It came like later, during the first lesson. But I was able to speak, but not understand like at all what they were saying because it was the Tahitian accent. So I'd had American teachers in the MTC who'd spoken to me, and of course their accents were, not too far off, but still they're American. And then I'd heard the Parisian accent, like the French accent, in movies and things like that. So the Tahitian accent was just like this weird thing, and I just didn't understand very much at all. So my Tahitian companion, strangely, I was able to understand her perfectly. So I would say something, they would say stuff I didn't understand, she would repeat it back to me, and then I would speak, and it was just like this cycle. And so we interacted through my Tahitian companion. So that was all right at the beginning. And then very quickly I realized that I just needed to spend a lot of time listening to everything that they were saying, their conversation, their jokes, their way of expressing things. And I would literally just like in chunks, like memorize. Like I just memorized like phrases, or I'd memorize like it was literally like monkey see, monkey do. What they would do or say, like I would understand the context and I'd understand how to use it, and then I would just like use it until I kind of figured it out, how to construct my own sentences. It was beneficial as a missionary to know French and Tahitian, because sometimes when you're walking on the streets, there are a lot of young people who are all speaking French. And then sometimes you'll go to an older person, elderly, and you'll start speaking to them in French and they'll understand you. But it is the coolest thing when you realize that they have trouble speaking French back to you. So you ask them if they speak Tahitian, and like 99% of the time, if it's an older person, they do speak Tahitian. And so you'll just start speaking in Tahitian to like re-explain something, and then they will just totally open up and they become like a totally different person. They get really into it. When I first got there, I kind of thought Tahitians were like very angry people because their voice gets really animated and really loud and really deep most of the time for men and women. But knowing Tahitian as a missionary was just another way to show them how much I loved them, enough to learn their cultural language. And the dynamics were really, you speak French most of the time on the main island, and then you learn Tahitian. You can learn quite a bit of Tahitian on the main island if you look for it, if you try and speak it, if you practice. But it's mostly in the outer islands where you speak Tahitian. Yes. There was one old man, and all the old men in Tahiti are called papis, and then the grandma people are called mamis. So there's one papi who did not really want to hear the gospel. He was not interested. And but we went to visit him anyway, just to introduce ourselves as missionaries, kind of befriend him and get to know him. And when we got there, we were speaking French, and he was kind of like, not really interested. And then I said, sorry, before we leave, do you mind if I practice my Tahitian on you? And like I'd spoken Tahitian for a while, so I knew it was okay. But I just wanted to do something different. And so I started speaking Tahitian to him, and I just basically bore my testimony. And it was the coolest thing because he went from being a very closed off man with like this long white ponytail. He kind of looks Native American, super bronzed, super tan. And he, as soon as I started speaking Tahitian, that was the first time he made eye contact with me. And as I spoke Tahitian, I could see him change, and I could see him become like almost like a little bit amazed to see a white girl speaking Tahitian. That was a big thing. Sometimes I like represented all white people. Sometimes I was the first white person that someone had seen. And so speaking Tahitian kind of created this awareness I think that missionaries were there with an important message, and we were able to teach him forever for several months after that, right up until I left. So they pretty much identify themselves in two ways. There's not a lot of work going on in Tahiti. The educational system is not the best necessarily. So the two ways that they identify are family and religion. And that's like how they introduce themselves. I'm this person. They normally introduce their last name first, so you can identify and place them. There aren't too many family names in Tahiti. They're just big families. And sometimes they intermarry. So they always tell you, it's almost like a Lord of the Rings thing when they're like, I'm Aragon, son of blah, blah, blah. You know, that's literally how they introduce themselves. And so it's important to understand also that they live together most of the time in families. Like there would be a street and that is like one family. It's like, there might be multiple houses, or it might just be one house that has been added onto. And it's just like the aunt moves in, or the grandma gets old, and so they take care of her and she lives with them. So family is important in the sense that they're very close in terms of feeling connected to each other, because everyone kind of associates with family. It's almost become like the norm. So they almost don't really interact like families here. It's just like their neighbors or their friends. Even though they are all family and they all live together, they're not necessarily close. They kind of do their own thing, but they live together. And the other way is religion. So obviously as a missionary, that's kind of exciting because everyone's interested in religion. Pretty much every single person we met believed in God, which was a huge stepping stone to introduce everything else about the gospel. But it was hard because they took it very, they accepted everyone. They kind of saw the truth in all religions. Some big demographics religiously were Jehovah's Witness, Sanito, do you know? Okay. It's like the break-off church of the Mormon church, but they believe that it was Joseph Smith's sons. And it's just like successively until recently, the most recent prophet of their church had no sons. So then they gave women the priesthood. So I think it's like Community of Christ or something.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah. And Catholic, pretty big, not as big as you might expect on the main island, but pretty big in the outer islands. So the Mormon church is only maybe, single-digit percentage of the population. Still substantial, but about half of its members are inactive just because there is kind of an acceptance of all religions. And they don't really differentiate. So it was cool to see people realize that the Book of Mormon, even though they have it in the Community of Christ Church, they could kind of read it and gain a testimony of it and differentiate. That was a big thing. We as missionaries, we didn't really teach them anything new. We just helped them differentiate when they felt the Spirit and when they didn't. And if they participated in the activities of our church and they felt that peace or comfort, that was like the defining moment for them, if they accepted that as the manifestation or not. We would tell them things and they would believe us right away. And so you had to be very careful. You had to make sure that you knew the doctrines, that you weren't having to correct things later or anything else. It was hard to make sure that they had that solid conversion to the church and not just an acceptance of our beliefs or the church culture. The demographic that I would describe as being the most accepting is not a religion, it's not a culture, it's a mother with children. Her husband normally wasn't interested. We taught many, many middle-aged women who put into practice the things that we taught, and it was they were mostly motivated by love for their children and wanting to find peace and stability. Life in Tahiti is really hard. Most people live in poverty. It was mostly houses that they kind of built themselves, or not out of like palm tree leaves or anything, like, drywall or cardboard or something, but that was the majority of the lessons that we taught with progressing investigators were mothers of children. Normally they were not married. to the father of their children. And so that became a big block for a lot of the progressing investigators, was that we had these mothers with real testimonies who wanted to change the lives for their children, and they progressed and they went to church, and sometimes they brought their kids too, but they needed to get married before they could be baptized. That was a huge block. The food in Tahiti is very starchy. Very, very starchy. They have a lot of carbs in their diet. I think it's attributed to the fact that a lot of people are poor, so buying things like rice or the French baguettes, those things are subsidized by the French government. So you can buy a lot of it in large quantities, and they have big families, and you can eat a lot of it, and it fills you up, and it gives you all of your energy that you need. Hence the reason a lot of Polynesians are maybe a little bigger compared to American culture. It was very common to have like pasta, bread, mashed potatoes, and like some other kind of starch in one meal. So when we ate at members' houses, it was very much, you had to kind of choose, and you had to talk a lot so they wouldn't realize if you weren't eating everything, because just you would get so sick. I got food poisoning 6 times my first 3 weeks in Tahiti. I think the rice, it's just very hard on my stomach personally, and I thought I could eat anything. But one of the things important to understanding Tahitian food is that it is the mix of those 3 cultures: Chinese, French, and Polynesian. So the Chinese you get a lot of rice, stir fry, kind of Chinese food. And the French, you would get like the really cool desserts, and like you'd get like the really like almost like beautiful food, and it was like art sometimes. I loved seeing that because it got very creative. And then the Polynesian, you get a lot of like fruits and fish, and fish is rarely cooked in Tahiti. They eat a lot of raw fish, and it's called poisson cru. And so what they would do is they would just mix it. Poisson cru is one of their most like Tahitian classic foods. You chop up raw fish, just like tuna, and then you mix it with carrots and cucumber and coconut milk, and you mix it right before you eat it. So like you get there and everything is on the table except for poisson cru, and then they just go ahead and like mix it all together, and they put it on the table, you pray, and then you eat like right away. And eating raw fish is, you just can't think about it like while you're eating it. You can't think about the fact that it's raw fish. And then later you realize like, oh, I just ate raw fish. And then for the first 3 weeks I was like sick, but it was really good. I like by the end of my mission, I was like requesting it all the time. Very classic Tahitian dish. Other than that, just large quantities. It was almost like classic food like spaghetti or stir fry, or just some kind of like steak and fries situation. Kind of American in a lot of senses. We have that blend of cultures here. But another classic Tahitian dish was fafaru, which is also raw fish. I know I'm going with the fish theme, but it was fish that you put in salt water in a closed container, and you let it sit in the sun for like a couple of weeks, depending on how strong you wanted it. Yeah, it was kind of like a rite of passage to become a Tahitian missionary. And then you eat it with fermented coconut milk. So, and that's called miti hue, which is Tahitian. And you could smell it throughout like the entire neighborhood. So everyone knew when someone was making fafaru, and they made it all the time. They like it really salty. And you would just eat it as fast as possible. You wouldn't chew it, you just swallow it whole. And I only ate it once. I would have eaten it if it had been offered more often, but couldn't have handled it probably the first 6 months of my mission. And by the end of my experience as a Tahitian missionary, I felt like I could have eaten dirt and been fine. I felt like my immune system was just like the best of the best. And yeah, all the fruits there are just delicious and juicy and everywhere. Mangoes, bananas. Bananas are smaller and they're sweeter. Mangoes are just huge and juicy and just incredible. Pineapple, super sweet. Also smaller. It's almost like the fruit is smaller, and so it's like condensed, like the flavor and everything. Avocados were huge. Avocados were like this big. And you'd go to someone's house, and sometimes you'd be eating dinner, and then for dessert, they would say, okay, like what fruit do you guys want? And you just like look around their backyard and you'd see like papaya, mango, pineapple, banana. Like, oh, I'd love a banana. And they're like, okay, great. And they go and pick it off the tree for you, and then you just eat it. And it was crazy. It was so good, and it was so fresh, and it was free, obviously. Because for desserts in Tahiti, they don't like sweet things. Even the chocolate was very savory. There was pretty much no sugar in anything, which is hard because I love sugar. And I was like, what is happening? This is a chocolate cake that has no sweetness. But yeah, they're very savory, but they get their sugar from fruit mostly. Yeah, well, with any food that you don't really like, or it's hard to chew, or it's hard to appreciate, swallow it whole. I got so good. I could swallow any pill. Like I can swallow a horse pill at this point. I could just swallow anything whole. Sea urchin was really, really weird for me. It was like the texture of like tongue. It was like a ball. It was like with like bumps, all over it. Really chewy. And I don't know if it was the way it was prepared or not, but it tasted like Windex. Like it was just like really chemical. And yeah, and it was like that the 2 or 3 times that I ate it. So I don't know what it was. I think sea urchin are poisonous, so I might have been eating poison. I'm not really sure. Still not sure what happened. I think you're protected as a missionary, so you can kind of have some leeway with that. But didn't like that particularly. And sometimes they would give you cooked fish, but like the whole fish. Like it's literally like they took it out of the ocean, they cooked it, and then they put it on your plate. So it had the eyeballs and like the jaw, like it was just a fish, and people would eat the eyeballs, and they tried to get me to eat the eyeballs, but that was kind of one thing I was like, sorry guys, that's not happening. I wish I could, but I'd probably like be sick right then. They really like suck the eyeball juice. With some smaller fish, you can eat the bones. One thing I also never ate, it's mostly in the outer islands, is dog meat. Yeah, dogs are definitely like the meat of outer islands. I heard about it a lot, and it was really disturbing because I have a dog, and so it was like that whole connection. I was like, oh, that's really inhumane. But yeah, one time the elders told us a story. They were on an outer island, and they saw like a dog out front, just like running around, I don't know. They went inside, and it was like a lesson, and then followed by a meal. And so yeah, and there were some people who were like in and out, like preparing dinner and everything. And they sat down to the dinner table, and they were eating, and the members are like, hey, like, do you like the meat? And they think it's really funny to feed Americans like dog meat, just to see how we react. You try and not react, but they're like, yeah, this is great, like really good, like it's kind of dark, it's like really tender, like what is it? And they're like, do you remember that dog you saw out front? And they were like, oh my gosh. So it was kind of obviously kind of traumatic. The elders just laughed about it a lot. I was like super traumatized, but yeah, it's definitely a common meat in the outer islands. Never ate it though. 2 big ones: word of wisdom, law of chastity. Word of wisdom, no one was really married. It was a huge surprise when a couple was married. It was definitely the exception rather than the rule. It was also hard to get people to marry because normally they had children. They didn't really see the benefit, or, they felt commitment was a big problem. The second one, word of wisdom, pretty much everything. Like, I'd say the biggest was coffee, followed closely by drugs. In Tahiti, drugs grow very easily. Marijuana, yeah, pretty much any kind of drug to kind of numb your senses, which I'm not very well versed in the drug culture, unfortunately. I should have learned more as a missionary. But yeah, Tahiti, the climate, it's hot and humid all year round. People can grow drugs anywhere at any time, and life is hard, so they really, there are a lot of people who struggled with addiction to drugs. It's very easy to grow, and then they could also sell it to make money. Jobs are very hard to come by. So it wasn't just an escape or anything. It was also sometimes a financial or economic opportunity. So there were a lot of 12-step programs that we put into place. And normally, generally speaking, it was the men who struggled with that. So if we could get them to kind of change their life through drugs, then we could typically get them to marry their girlfriend or the mother of their children. So it was definitely a word of wisdom priority almost sometimes, and then stabilize the family in that way before they could get married. So I was with my companion, and it was the end of the night, and we just had stuff on the floor, and I was just like, I'll just sweep it outside real fast before we go to sleep. Like, it literally would have taken 15 seconds probably just to quickly like sweep, and then sweep out the door. And as I opened the door to like do the final sweep to get all the junk off the floor outside, the companion I had was like, whoa, like, you cannot do that. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm cleaning the house. And she's like, no, you can't do that at night. Like, wait until morning. And I was like, why? She's like, you'll let bad spirits in. I was like, okay, choose your battles. And so I just like left a pile of dirt and stuff in the corner until morning, and then I swept it out. And I mean, we'll never know what would have happened otherwise. But also vitamins, taking vitamins was seen as a bad thing. I had vitamins because I got a lot of food poisoning in Tahiti. And I had a companion who kept asking me if I was drugging myself. I was like, no, they're vitamins. They're good for you. And she's like, no, that lets bad spirits into your body. Like, you need it naturally, like in the food you eat. I'm like, well, I'm not getting it naturally in the food I eat, so I need to take these. And so anyway, it was kind of a joke, but she was kind of superstitious about it. So she like kept an eye on me. She's like, I'll watch if anything happens. I'm like, all right, go for it. I need to take vitamins so I can be healthy. I heard one story during my mission. We were teaching someone, older man and his wife, and next door was his brother and his brother's wife. And he said that his brother was jealous of him because of how beautiful his wife was. And so he said that she kept having these weird health problems, and he attributed that to voodoo being done by his brother and his wife. That was the only experience I had of voodoo. They are very big into possession. That was kind of like, in terms of like the supernatural side. I was the missionary of a woman who we started teaching, and she just had this very dark look about her. All the time. She was sweet, but she just had like really I don't know how to explain it. It was a very dark look. And she actually became interested in the church after we gave her a priesthood blessing, and she felt as though this dark presence was removed, and she physically changed. She was light. I just thought she was like almost African when I first met her, like just very dark skin. And then after this priesthood blessing, she literally I realized like she's kind of like just slightly tanned. And I don't know, I know that sounds kind of weird and kind of like a little bit trippy, but yeah, it was it was a powerful testimony to the power of the priesthood, because there are evil spirits, and the Tahitians are very feeling people. They feel a lot of things. They can feel if someone's sincere. They can feel if something's not right or off. And so they're very keyed into supernatural presence. It's almost the opposite. It's like, get rid of all of your table manners and fit in. Do what they do. Eat with your fingers. Pretty much the same concept as learning the language, like learning to understand. Just do what they do and imitate it. And just by force of nature, they're going to accept you. So I was very much into like cutting up everything. I mean, you still like use a fork and knife, but you don't use utensils when at all possible to just eat it with your hands. There's no like burping situation at the end of a meal. It's not like that. But when you eat, just don't try to be so like the Queen of England when you eat, because then they kind of see you as prissy and a little bit distant, a little bit snobby. And a lot of American missionaries struggled with connecting to people, and they didn't know why, and then they realized it's because they were kind of offended by how like proper they were with their table manners. The importance of greeting people every time you see them. So it's almost another opposite, but you do greet everybody. You wave to people when you see them. Even if you don't really know them, you still wave. They greet so the sister missionaries could greet the sisters or women or whatever with a peace, like kiss on each cheek, and then you always shake hands with the men. And if you failed to do that, it was kind of seen as like a very obvious rejection, and they take it very hard. And they're very sensitive people, so you don't want to lose favor with them. You greet everyone. You don't necessarily need to be happy or smiling, because they can see that as kind of obnoxious. Generally speaking, this is all very general, but you make sure that you are very friendly.
We left LA around midnight, so you get to Tahiti right before sunrise. And so I remember distinctly like getting off the plane, and you get off the plane there and you walk down the steps and you walk across the tarmac. And I remember hitting the outside of the plane and just feeling the humidity. And it was just before sunrise, and just feeling like this is it, like I'm here. And then mission president and his assistants picked us up, and driving to the mission president's house for breakfast, I just remember feeling a little overwhelmed, but then also almost like a tourist. Just like my eyes are really big, and just like taking pictures of the most random stupid things, because Tahiti is different. You know, it's different than anywhere I had ever been. It's very tropical, you know, green everywhere. Everything's green, and on one side of the road drops off to the ocean, the other side it goes straight up to a mountain. And so yeah, just culturally and language-wise, I just remember feeling really overwhelmed, but feeling like I'm finally here, you know. And yeah, that's about all I remember about first arriving. And then the first day was a whirlwind. Went to the mission president's house, had breakfast, had interviews, and then I got put straight on another airplane to go off to another island. So I was only on Tahiti for about 8 hours. And then I was off to another island, off to Bora Bora. It was my first area. And got there about sunset. And so on Bora Bora, you land on an island off of the main island. It's called a motu. And that's where the airport is. And then you hop on a boat, a shuttle boat that takes you to the main island. So me and another American missionary went together to Bora Bora. And we got on the shuttle boat, Elder Jones and I. And our mission companions met us there at the airport. So, you know, from that moment on, it was like, you know, hardly any English spoken. You know, they don't speak a lot of English in Tahiti. And so it was just dive into the cultural experience. We got off the boat on the other side and loaded our bags in the back of this little tiny pickup truck and hopped in the back and rode in the back of the pickup truck to our cinder block house. And yeah, it was a lot to happen in one day, a lot of culture shock in one day. Got to this little rickety bed, this little tiny mattress, and this, you know, just a lot of culture shock, from the houses to the, you know, level of living and how people live, humidity and everything. It was a lot to take in the first day, and a little overwhelming. And then that first week was even more so. So the first day was just the tip of the iceberg. The Tahiti Mission is one of the oldest missions in the church. I believe, so Addison Pratt went there back, you know, right at the beginning of the church. So I need to brush up on my mission history, but I believe it was while Joseph Smith was still a prophet. And so it was part of mission to the Sandwich Islands in Hawaii, and then down to Tahiti. So the church has been there for a long time. Church membership is about 25,000, which is about 10% of the general population. So it's the third or fourth largest church in French Polynesia. It's the Tahiti Papeete Mission, but it's all of French Polynesia, which is actually, at least at the time when I was there, is the largest geographical mission in the world. But, you know, 95% of that was ocean. So, you know, there's a couple hundred islands in the mission. Not all of them have missionaries on them. Not all of them have people on them. Right when I was there, there were not as many missionaries. Since the age change, I think there's around 150 missionaries there now, which is a lot. We had about 50 to 60 while I was there. So there are a lot more missionaries, a lot more islands that are open to missionaries now. You kind of have your main islands. You've got Tahiti, and then above Tahiti, you have Raiatea, Bora Bora, Taha'a, Huahine. There's a group of islands up there called Raromatai, and then you've got the Marquesas Islands, which don't have a lot of members and missionaries there, and then the Tuamotu Islands, which are a big long string of atolls. Very small populations. I was able to serve on 2 different ones that each only had about 300 people living there. And then you've got the Austral Islands, and then it also includes the Cook Islands, which are English speaking. So it's a big mission, a lot of different opportunities to go serve on different islands, although the majority of the population lives on Tahiti, and then in Raromatai, which is the other small group of islands. In Tahiti, it's very much like Hawaii, I guess, where there's, most everyone speaks French, which is the official language, but it's even not so much as much as Hawaii, where Hawaiian language is dying. Tahitian language is still very strong, especially in the outer islands. So most missionaries that go there learn, when you go through the MTC, you do learn both languages. Most missionaries have opportunity to become fluent in both languages. So it kind of depends on the areas you serve. The further you are away from Tahiti, the more Tahitian you'll learn, the more time you'll spend speaking Tahitian. And then a lot of it depends on your effort, how much you want to put in, how much you want to learn Tahitian, and then also how quickly you pick up on French. French will be your primary language. Most people speak and understand French, but it's not uncommon to go to a lesson or a dinner appointment and have the grandparents there speaking in Tahitian, the parents there responding to their parents in Tahitian, and then speaking to their kids in French. So you've got the 3 generations, and kind of the middle generation speaks and understands both. The younger generation really mostly speaks French, and the older generation mostly speaks Tahitian. So, and then a lot of it is mixed, where the younger kids will use Tahitian as slang, and it's kind of Frahitian, they mix the languages a lot, and so you do end up learning both and at least understanding a lot of both. It's very unique that way, where it's very bilingual mission. Because of that, you spend a little bit more time at the MTC because you are learning 2 languages in most cases. But yeah, that's kind of the history of the mission. Is very, very old and very strong and very cultured. There's a mission reunion that all of the mission reunions are for the entire mission, not based on when people served, but every 6 months, Friday before a general conference, there's a mission reunion in Salt Lake for anyone who's ever served in Tahiti. A lot of Tahitians come, they serve Tahitian food, and so it's just a massive reunion. And that's just kind of the nature of the mission, is very inclusive. We're all one mission. It's not really divided up by mission president or by time served. So the weather is very consistent. It's a consistent 80, low 80s with high humidity. It's actually just about the same distance below the equator as Hawaii is above the equator, and then almost directly below it. So the weather is very similar in that way, because the islands are basically just opposite seasons. Although there's really very few seasons, kind of hotter and not as hot, and rainy and not as rainy. So the weather is very consistent that way. I remember riding my bike and during certain times of the year, and almost all the time, just expecting that a couple times a week I'm going to be riding my bike dripping wet because it's going to rain, and it's just going to rain for 15-20 minutes, and it's going to downpour, and then it'll be clouds will be gone, and it'll be sunny, and you'll dry out pretty quick. But the weather is very nice and mild, besides the rain, which is pretty common for a Pacific island. But their living conditions in Tahiti, Tahiti is because it's so heavily influenced by France, there are a lot of opportunities for Tahitians to have a lot of nice things. that wouldn't be afforded to them without the French government subsidizing and providing opportunities as far as education and things like that. And so I think it is very similar to most Polynesian cultures where, and in talking with my friends who went to Central and South America, they said, we found a lot of similarities in just living conditions and kind of how people live. And also, I think a lot of it has to do with the climate, where houses are very open. The windows are always open, doors are always open. Rarely are, the doors, if the doors are closed and the windows are closed, that people are gone from that house for an extended period of time, not just for the day. And so it's houses are open. There's not, like real secure windows. There's a lot of louver windows, that flip back and forth. And housing conditions are pretty good. They have a lot of houses that they call Fare MTR, which is, I'm not even sure what the MTR stands for, but it's basically a kind of a house they all look the same. They're made out of wood up on stilts, and all of the materials are provided. It's like a kit that you order, and I believe they're subsidized from the government, and so you can get a house that way. A lot of the other houses are cinder block walls, ceramic tile floors, usually an open patio where people do most of their eating and often they're cooking outside on the patio. But yeah, living conditions are definitely not like they are here in the United States or here in Utah, but it's not necessarily because, they don't have the means. It's often just the way of life. One thing that's very common is for there to not be a toilet seat, which is, I'm just thinking about things that I remember as I was first going there that kind of shocked me. And then as I've taken my wife back, things that she's mentioned and commented on, or like, not in missionary homes, but in other people's homes, like not having a bathroom door, just having basically a curtain in front of the bathroom. And and then not having a toilet seat where it's just like they've taken the whole toilet seat off, so you just sit on the toilet. And not a lot of hot water, but the water is naturally warmer. So I took a lot of cold showers on my mission, which I think has changed a lot since I've been there. I think there are a lot more water heaters in mission homes. Rarely do you see air conditioning. Things that kind of shocked me that weren't there, that I think there are more now, but like microwaves. Microwaves are almost non-existent. So there's a lot of things that are different than here, but like I said, it's not necessarily that they don't have the means. It's just a different way of living, and you just kind of get used to it. But that are definitely take an adjustment from, at least from me. I was just kind of a spoiled American growing up here with, lots of things that really once you've lived otherwise, you realize are unnecessary. A lot of extra frills to the house and to life, and like extra decorations and things like that around the house that just seem unnecessary because it's a very simple way of life. Everyone lives a very simple life down there. A lot of people will, and it really depends on where you are as well. My time on Tahiti was very different from my time out on Apataki or Arutua, small Tuamotus, where out in Tuamotus, like I said, there were only about 300 people there. There was only 1 or 2 cars on the whole island, and everyone just kind of shared the car. Like literally everyone would just borrow the car from somebody. And people there would just either work in the pearl farm or they would just fish. And they'd go out and fish, and then they'd kind of sell their fish and just make enough money doing something to buy the things that they can't get there. So they can get a lot of things from the land. They eat a lot of fish, but then they'll buy rice and just very simple things that they need, rice and soy sauce and salt and things that you can't get from the land. The rest of it, bread, fruit, fish, things that they can grow, they'll just grow and eat that and kind of live off of the land. And so Tahiti is really nice that way. People always say you could survive in Tahiti off the land. You don't need a job in Tahiti because you can find everything you need. Fruit trees just grow naturally, and coconut trees all over the place, and there's fish, and things just grow well. Pineapple there, some of the best pineapple in the world. And so A lot of people do just live off the land, just get a job to just kind of get by. Although I think it is changing a lot. A lot more younger people are going to school, getting education, getting more, regimented jobs and careers. Whereas older generation is more, farming and kind of agriculture, construction type things, type of jobs. So there's a good variety. Closer you are to Papeete, the more it is like America. The more it is like what we would call a first world country. The further away, the more I guess you could say it's more like a third world country. So there's a lot of variety in that aspect, depending on where you serve. Transportation system in Tahiti, they have a bus system that is completely awful. In fact, it's funny, I have been back a couple times with my wife, and as I go back as a tourist and I talk to people about tourism and I talk to the hotels and things, they'll even tell you don't rely on the bus system, because you just never know when the bus is going to come, when it's really operating. So transportation in there, as a missionary, there are quite a few vehicles, but then also a lot of bicycle. And, you ride your bike a lot in a lot of areas. For people visiting Tahiti, the only reliable way to get around is to rent a car, or to know somebody that can let you have a car, borrow a car. The island takes about 2 hours to drive around the whole island of Tahiti, so it's pretty small. In fact, the whole island of Tahiti would fit inside the Great Salt Lake, and that's the biggest landmass there. So it's very small. It doesn't seem like you would need much transportation, but it does take quite a bit to get places, and the only road is around the outside of the island. So even though you may look on a map and say, oh, well, we're not very far from Papeete to Papara, it's still a good hour and a half drive. So you really do need a vehicle. A lot of tourism in Tahiti, but not as much as say Hawaii. It's a lot more expensive to get there, and it's also not as touristy, where it's much more, I guess, there's not as many things for tourists to do that are geared towards tourists. Although, some of the islands like Bora Bora and Moorea are some of the most, visited and, highest priced places to visit as a tourist, because the islands themselves are so naturally beautiful. So a lot of the things that tourists do are in the water, snorkeling, scuba diving, visiting the beach and just spending time outside. There are quite a few hikes to go on in Tahiti. So there are a lot of things in that regard. But like I said, not a lot of people in Tahiti speak English. And so I had some friends that went and visited Tahiti on a separate vacation, and they mentioned to me, they said, we've traveled all over the world, and Tahiti was one of the hardest places to communicate, because very few people spoke fluent English, which seems weird to when everyone speaks French and you go to France and almost everyone speaks English. In Tahiti, they don't need to. They don't have a lot of tourists. They're not connected to. It's not like Europe, where they're connected to a lot of other nations and do a lot of international business and a lot of communication. Although, like I said, everything is very much changing. For example, while I was there, it was very difficult to find places with the internet. And since I've gone back, the internet is everywhere, And as I've been online, and friends and, past, investigators connect with me on Facebook and are on Facebook constantly, you can tell that the internet has spread. And so a lot of that international communication has spread, and a lot more of the younger people are learning English and speaking English, just because of the internet and that international connection. So Tahitian culture is very much a Polynesian culture, very open, very loving, very, in Hawaii they say it's the spirit of aloha. Tahiti, they have the word arofa, or aroha, it's the same word, but meaning love, charity, and it's very much alive. It's not uncommon for missionaries to go tracting and go out, and when you go, instead of knocking on doors, you just ride your bike or pull up to a house and you just walk up close and you yell out "Yorana," which means hello, and then somebody will hear you and come out and, say, they'll always, greet you very politely, very kind. And often, especially even if they're not members, if they recognize the missionaries, often if it's around mealtime, they'll say, Yorana mai tama'a, which means come and eat. So, very first meeting with them is they're inviting you to their table to eat, and that's a very common thing. It's not uncommon to be overfed, because there are a lot of members and they do like to invite the missionaries in, but also because there are just a lot of people there who, that's what they do, is they invite people to their home, sit down and eat. We're having dinner, everyone's eating, come eat with us. Welcome to our home, you're always welcome here. Which can pose problems for missionary work, because a lot of times you'll get a lot of investigators who will take the lessons continuously and invite you to their home every week, and you'll go back every week thinking that you're making progress, and really they're just happy to have somebody come visit you and visit them in their home. And I remember teaching one guy who we taught him for weeks and weeks and weeks in Tahitian, and we would ask him about Joseph Smith and go over the restoration, and he'd say, oh yeah, absolutely, I agree. And then we'd get to the end and he'd say, oh no, but thank you for coming. Well, will you come to church with us? Oh, well, I have my church and everything that you're telling me is true, but thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Yes, come back next week. That would be great. And it's just that kind of spirit of welcoming, everybody come into our home and you're part of our family, which was a really huge blessing for me to learn. It's that charity and pure love of Christ that we learn about in the scriptures, that they really live, not just in the church, but as a culture, as a people. And like I said, that's one of the challenges of missionary work there, is overcoming that and knowing when you have true conversion and when somebody's just being charitable and nice and inviting you in. It can be difficult for young missionaries to adapt to that, especially as they serve with Tahitian companions. It's something that I think is really important for missionaries to learn, and I had a lot of hard lessons that I learned at the beginning and throughout my mission of understanding that love and that concern, but that concern often will lead to what, especially as Americans, we live very regimented lives. And so while mission rules may seem difficult, they're not as difficult for us to live, because we are very regimented, and for the most part, where we've grown up with regimented schedules, and you do this at this time and you do these things and here are the rules. And Polynesians are much more relaxed, and so mission rules can be very difficult, especially for Tahitian missionaries that are in their home. I served with companions who were serving in their home stake. One who was serving in a ward that he had previously lived in when he was a teenager. And so that can prove to be very challenging to focus on missionary work. And then on top of that, you throw in a lot of mission rules that don't seem to apply to a Polynesian culture. Like in the MTC, they told us, make sure that you never you stay as far away from the beach as you can, and never eat shellfish and never eat uncooked fish. And it's like, that is like, out of my areas, probably 85% of them, I was living on the beach, and a good portion of their diet is raw fish. And so it's like, there are a lot of mission rules that you have to remember may not apply directly to your mission. And that's, I think, any mission around the world, where you're going to have specific challenges and specific things that you have to adapt to. You have to be willing to adapt to. Knowing that ahead of time will allow you to be open to, okay, things may not be quite as what I expected them to be on a mission, but there are going to be other things, other blessings, like learning charity and love in ways that you wouldn't other places. So a very common question is, okay, you learn French and Tahitian, they must be pretty similar. And it couldn't be further from the truth. French is a Latin language. I often compare, it's like Spanish and Tongan, because a lot of people have heard Tongan or Hawaiian. They've heard how it sounds. Tahitian is a Polynesian language similar to Tongan, Samoan, Hawaiian. Words are very similar, sounds are similar. French is a Latin language, and so they're very different, completely different. What the difference in French is that French in Tahiti is very informal, and then they roll their R's. So instead of the R in the back of the throat that most people are familiar with French, because of the Tahitian language, there are a lot of R's and T's in Tahitian, and so they're rolled off the tongue. And so French in Tahiti has the R's rolled. The other interesting thing about Tahitian is that, any Polynesian language, you pronounce the vowels, and it's usually the long form of the vowel. So A is ah, I is E, the letter E is pronounced A, O is O, and U is U. And so if you can pronounce those vowels all the time with those sounds, you're going to be pretty close. There are times where that does change a little bit. And then besides that, there are consonants. And Tahitian has very few consonants, T being the most common. And in the written language, you'll see other letters that are actually pronounced with a T. So a common thing that missionaries do is run out and buy a Tahitian Book of Mormon after they get their call. And they say, okay, and they're trying to pronounce it, it's Te Buka a Moromona. Well, that word buka, B-U-K-A, it looks like book, but it's actually pronounced puta. So the B has a P sound and the K has a T sound. So there's a lot of words like that where the written language, you substitute consonant sounds for other consonants. So like the T, the D, and the S, and there's a whole bunch that are the K, the C, they're all pronounced with the T sound. P is another one. R is another common one where you don't have very many consonant sounds. So the language is very simple. It's also very simple grammatically, where you don't have conjugation of verbs. You have a sentence is set up with the tense, the verb, and who's doing it. So if I want to say I'm going to eat, I say a, which is the tense, the verb tama'a, which is to eat, and then I, vo, e tama'a vo. And so it's very simple, going, eat, I. And so it sounds almost like, if you were to translate it directly, it sounds kind of like cavemanish. And so it's a very simple language, but Tahitian is definitely the harder language to learn because French has so many similarities being a Latin language, and just the way the language is set up, and also vocabulary-wise. Tahitian vocabulary is nothing close to English whatsoever. There are a few words like buka, like puta, book, which looks similar, but that is only because those are words that Tahitians didn't originally have in their vocabulary. And when the Protestant missionaries came to Tahiti, I think in the 1500s or 1600s, they came and they brought Christianity to Tahiti. And so that's predominant religion there. Most people are Christian. Most people believe in Christ and in God. They translated, they were the first ones to write down the language. And so they brought a lot of words and vocabulary that weren't existent in Tahiti, like a book. Books weren't really existent, so the word for book looks like book, but it's pronounced differently, pronounced the way that they pronounce things in Tahitian. So another one is hammer. The word for hammer is hamara. So but there's only a handful of those that look like English. The rest of them don't look anything like English. And it can be very long and challenging. Names can be long and challenging, and people speak very fast. So Tahitian is hard to learn. You learn French, and then French becomes your first language, and Tahitian becomes the language that you're learning. It's not one that you really can even get a good jump on. You just kind of have to be there and get thrown to the fire and thrown to the wolves. And it takes, I remember about 6 months into my mission feeling confident in French. About 9 to 12 months in, feeling confident in Tahitian. And then it wasn't until the very end of my mission I felt like, okay, I'm fluent enough in Tahitian where the conversation doesn't have any lulls, where they don't realize that I'm still learning this language. So it can be a challenge, but it's a fun challenge to learn both and continue to learn both. I guess I'll share a story of a couple of guys that I met about halfway through my mission in a town called Totira. One was named Manu, and he had a friend named Tate. And Manu, we met them at a mission open house, at an open house at the church that was put on by the ward. And Manu and Tate, Manu was about, 10 years older than Tate. Tate was only about 16 at the time. And Manu had a wife and a daughter, and they started taking the lessons with us. And Manu, both of them right away latched onto the lessons very quickly. Manu gained a testimony very quickly of the prophet Joseph Smith. I remember distinctly having that lesson, feeling the Spirit very strongly testify to all of us that Joseph Smith was a true prophet. The gospel was restored through him, and Manu was this guy who's covered in tattoos and was just kind of a young guy just living life. And we weren't sure about what he did with his time. He was just kind of always at home, always around. And he latched on the lessons quickly, but then as things progressed, he all of a sudden started falling away and wasn't there when we were supposed to have lessons, and we weren't sure what was happening. And we learned that Manu had a problem with drugs, with marijuana, and that he was pretty involved with the farming and the sale of marijuana. And that was basically that he had to make a choice in his life between the gospel of Jesus Christ and his livelihood. Not just, a drug problem, but how he made his money and supported his family and did basically all of his friends and his entire life. Growing up, that was his life. And Tate was younger, and he had similar problems, but his influence was his father, who was against him joining the church, and then the influence of Manu and these friends as well. It's really interesting that, Manu and his wife were ready to be baptized, but they were going to do it together. As I left the area, Manu hadn't been baptized. He still wasn't taking the lessons anymore. And a couple months after I left the area, one Monday morning, I just had an impression to call Manu, and I called their house, and Leah answered, his wife, and she said, "I'm so glad you called. You must have heard." And I said, "No, I haven't heard. What did I hear? What happened?" And she said, "Well, Manu was baptized last week, and then this week was the first time he blessed the sacrament." And there was an incredible joy to feel that Manu had overcome that difficulty in his life. It was towards the end of my mission, and I saw them again the night that I left, and I wasn't sure how things were going. I heard at that time that they had kind of become inactive again, and that was really disappointing. Tate still was having struggles with his family and was never able to get baptized. And a couple years ago, when I went back to Tahiti, I didn't have a way of contacting them, so I just drove to their house and drove to Manu and Leia's house, and it was incredible joy to drive up to their house and to find them and to have them greet me just like old times, but to hear that Manu and Leia had been sealed in the temple and were consistently active in church, and he was the clerk in the ward bishopric, and that they were staying strong, and that Manu bore testimony to me that night when we taught that lesson about Joseph Smith, that he had that testimony then, and it stayed with him through all of his challenges and ups and downs, and still had that testimony today, and bore testimony to me of the power of the temple. And it was just a huge blessing to go back and see that people who have their lives touched, their hearts touched, may have huge difficulties to overcome in their life, and it may take a few years after, it may take a long time, but once they have that testimony, that can grow within them and keep pushing them, that it's not reliant on you as a missionary to be there to convert them, that you testifying and having the Spirit in your lessons will allow that to continue after. And if they're converted to you, and then you leave, and their testimony leaves with you. if they're converted with the Spirit, then that can continue to do work that you are not able to do after you leave. And I went back again just a few months ago and talked with them again, and they're still doing great. And it's a huge blessing to have that Spirit with you as a missionary, with your lessons, as you're finding people, and as you're teaching, so that that can continue to work after you leave. I know that the missions are incredible for the missionaries, as well as for those that they teach and they serve. My mission changed a lot of who I am. It changed my personality in a lot of ways for the better. It changed because of the Tahitian people, because of a lot of that culture that I've tried to adopt into my own life, and still is difficult to do. As I think about those things, I think, man, I need to be more charitable. I need to be more loving. I know that missionary is the right thing for people to do to strengthen their testimony of the gospel. It's important that you leave with a testimony, but it's also important to know that your testimony will grow exponentially as a missionary. And if you keep close to the Spirit throughout your mission, if you study and pray like you're supposed to, that your testimony will grow and strengthen. And I know that our Heavenly Father loves all of His children. It's really neat to go throughout the world, throughout to different missions and have very similar experiences as I talk with friends, and know that Heavenly Father loves all of His children, wherever they are on this earth.